Michael. Michael Joseph McCarey, born on a farm located on Rock Run, a road 4 miles from Turtle Point Corners, in the Sartwell Parish of St. Mary's, McKean County, PA, Pennsylvania. The year 1863. The fourth child of Patrick Thomas McCarey and Mary Caulfield McCarey. They were from the town of Monaghan, County Monaghan, Ireland. Patrick and his brother John came to America through the aid of their cousin, name of McPhillips. Pat was a bootmaker in Ireland. He was able to come to America as an indentured servant to a leather merchant in Friendship, New York. It was a 5-year contract. In Ireland, the leather worker skinned the animal, tanned the hide, made the boot to fit the man's feet. This job was mostly saddle and harness making. They had already tanned hides. McCarey worked out his time with the firm in Friendship, and in the course of time arranged for his girlfriend from Ireland to come to America, and they were married in Friendship, New York. I do not know if the brother John McCarey was on an indentured deal or not. The brothers were together for some time. The Civil War came on. John McCarey was in the Army. He went with the Penna militia, but was transferred to an Ohio regiment. The family lost contact. They never found out what happened to John McCarey. McPhillips got a job clearing right away for a survey party who were laying out a route for a rail line that became the Pennsylvania, Philadelphia to Buffalo route. He found out it was possible to file for land ownership in this area. He also found out that the land was measured on a map on a table. If a hill was on the property, a gain in acreage could be made. I don't know when McPhillips and McCarey filed on this property, 4 miles from the rail line up Rock Run Creek. Part of the old McPhillips barn was still standing, but there was only part of the old fireplace and chimney standing, where the house used to be. McCareys acquired the McPhillips property a long time ago. One of the McPhillips daughters married a man named McAuliffe from Allegheny, New York. They quite often spent some of their summers at the McCarey farm. Ray McAuliffe, their oldest son, spent several summers at the McCarey farm. Our families always visited back and forth quite a bit. When I was at St. Bona's at Allegheny, I used to see McAuliffes quite a bit. I was 8 years old when grandmother died. I remember her quite well. I see her as this small, feeble old lady. I can't imagine how she could have run this farm. Oxen, cows, sheep, and finally horses. Some 100 acres of very hilly farm. I know there were oxen, for when plowing one spring I turned up a couple of pieces of ox shoe. Uncle Gene explained them to me. In the tack room in the horse barn hung a couple of ox yokes and that kind of equipment. There also hung a couple of McClellan saddles. I tried to use one, but it was so hard and bony I gave it up. A blanket and a strap was much better. Old Maud had a kind of bumpy gait, but beat walking in the mud. I got to join the neighbor guys. My grandfather being a leather worker in his time, that meant skinning the hide, curing it, and working it into whatever it was going to be made into. Uncle Gene told me every Christmas they each got a pair of boots. That was a great thing to them. Grandfather died when Dad was a small boy, so if he got boots, they must have been hand-me-downs. Patrick McCarey died in his 30s of Bright's disease, an ailment that doesn't exist anymore. He left 5 children and a wife. Eugene 16, John 12, Eliza 5, Mary Ann, who died quite young, and Michael, a very small boy. He left this family and his wife with this good-sized farm, quite well stocked with oxen, cows, sheep, chickens, and a new team of horses. They made a go of it. It was Civil War Depression times. Uncle Gene has told me it was Civil War Depression times. No cash money available. Barter was the system. Milk, butter, cheese, apples, hides, eggs, for coffee, sugar, salt, nails traded, knitted mittens for cotton cloth. John got some traps and worked up a trade in hides, muskrat, skunk, and some mink. Uncle Gene was proud of John for getting this trade up and going on his own. He got bees and a honey trade. When Uncle Gene was only 15, he went down the Allegheny River to Pittsburgh on log rafts. His father and a man named Lundgren took log rafts and floated them at high water in the spring. Aunt Bestas explained that this was for real cash money, a big opportunity at the time. Uncle Gene drew real man pay for this job. After the ice broke up and the river was high was the right time to get this timber to the mills. The Allegheny River runs north out of Pennsylvania into New York State, and near Red House on the Seneca Indian Reservation, turns and runs south-west through the Allegheny foothills, joining the Monongahela to form the Ohio in the Pittsburgh area. Near Red House, where the river turned south, were shallows, and it was a tricky business to get the logs through this place. Some of the Seneca Indians were hired to guide the log rafts in this area. Quite often they had to split up the rafts, float the logs through these shallows, and reassemble down the river. An Indian by the name of King Jameson became friends. They made a number of trips together over the years. I remember meeting he and his wife when they came to pay a visit at the McCarey farm one summer when I was at the farm. I was asking Uncle Gene about the raft trips and Indians. He gave me some stories about river days. He mentioned Jameson liked a drink of whiskey, and it will make an Indian just as crazy as a white man. I think this was because Uncle John said it is illegal to give an Indian whiskey. John McCarey became a rabid pro-high teetotaler. This time when Uncle Gene and his father went down the river, somewhere along the route, a raft caught up with them that had left after they did. They brought word that grandmother was not well, so when they got paid off in Pittsburgh, they took off on foot overland. There was some sort of shortcut trail over the mountains. On the map, it shows about 200 miles. They put up one night in a lumber camp near Sharon, PA, after they had walked as long as they could see and slept on the trail. Uncle Gene said he just remembers walking half asleep with his arms over the two other men. A rough life, husky men. Uncle Gene was a 6-footer, very solid-built guy. Michael was a little over 6 feet, but thin. John McCarey was slightly smaller, but wiry and active. Uncle Gene was very pleasant and all business when he spoke, not a joker like John, who was the prankster. My dad used to say John was a born knave. He was settled down as I knew him, but I guess he really was a cut-up as a young guy. I enjoyed Uncle John, particularly if he would think up some prank. Guess I have some knave. These bits of family lore I know. They are not in good order of place or time. I am just trying to put them in as I recall them. Bits of talk with Aunt Bestas, Uncle Gene and John, the neighbors like Collies, Finns, Cantwells, and quite a bit of that Fred O'Brien conversation. Up in the Irish settlement were the Blyes, the John Bly family, the Jim Blys, a lot of young Blys. The McNallys, the next farm, had 2 boys, older than me. Collies, the next farm. Jerry was just my age, and Johnny Bly, son of Jim Bly, was near our age. The 2 Cantwell boys from a couple farms down the road were about my age. Frankie, a little older, and Skip just younger. We had a lot of fun at the old swimming hole. I had a good life on the farm, and am sure my dad had the same. It was smart of my folks to have me get up to the farm most every summer. As you go up Rock Run, it becomes pretty hilly, even steep. Driving a team up that way, we had to rest them quite a bit. Uncle Gene described the area as hard scrabble farming. There were a few people surviving up there. Philander Gibbs had a farm up that way, quite a character. John McCarey had a few stories about Gibbs, but I didn't get to hear very much about him. Either Uncle Gene or Aunt Bestas called me away at the most interesting part. There was a family of Murphys and Shongos. They were a renegade Indian group. They kept some livestock, did some farming, but mostly worked up and down the valley a day or two here. Uncle John sort of gave me an explanation of these people. John was real proud of his purebred red bull cattle. He went clear to Indiana to get 2 heifers and a bull, quality stock. John was explaining that if you want to have quality, you got to maintain a purebred line. Now those Murphys, Shongos, and Gibbs, there is no quality. Who knows how much of what is Gibbs, Murphy, or Shango or something? I figure them all Shango. A Shango can eat anybody's chickens. Our old sheep is pretty good at smelling out a Shango. They don't bother here very much. John was a county assessor for this area, so he got to visit each place once a year, file a record of who belonged to what. Our folks didn't visit, but sometimes haying or harvesting, they might have a Shango or Murphy work a day or so. I was up on the farm one thrashing time, and they had a couple of the Murphy boys helping out. I got to know the youngest, Renzo. He was called Shrimp. Later years, he was bumming about Bradford. He became sort of a nuisance. I felt sorry for the guy, a scurvy bum. He had a way of hitting you up at a bad time and place, embarrassing. "James, can't you do something for your good old pal Renzo?" He never worked for me, but I was a sucker for a few dollars now and then. I spin on about Irish settlements, but it's a springboard for almost everything in my dad's life. I recall Dad saying about Uncle Gene. He was Owen Eugene. The family often used the Owen, but he was known about as Gene McCarey. In these old Irish families, if the father was gone, the eldest son became the man of the house. To Dad, my Uncle Gene was the man. Of his father, Dad only knew what he was told. I remember having a nice evening talk with Father Joseph Colley, Jerry's uncle, lived on the farm above McCarey's. He was older than Dad, near Uncle Gene's age. He knew my grandfather very well. He said, "Jimmy, of course you don't know your grandfather. Now you McCareys all favor your grandmother. Your dad, Owen Liza, you are Caulfields. Now John McCarey looks more like his father, but your grandfather was a big man. I mean big so as to almost be awesome, at least to us kids. When we would get out of line, my mother would say, 'How are you going to explain that to the McCarey?' In those days, few could read and write. McCarey could, though, so if there was a paper to sign or some event was published, we took it to McCarey. He was accepted as judge and jury. Sundays after Mass, the neighbors stopped at McCarey's. He got the New York Times thrice a week, got it delivered to Sartwell Church. There was no rural delivery in those days. The news was read, some talk, a bit of trading, a little gossip. That was about our only weekly contact. Father Joe patted me on the knee and said, "Jimmy, he was a fine man. You got a lot to live up to. He was a great man. No newsman will ever get more intense attention than your grandfather got." I appreciated this evening and this conversation from Father Joe. He was a nice guy. There were 8 Colley kids. 4 boys became priests and eventually all in the same parish in Erie, Pennsylvania. 1 girl became a nun. The other girl married a man named Crowley. They had children, and one of their sons became a priest and eventually became an assistant to his uncles. He was Charlie Crowley, who was in St. Bona's when I was, but older and in the seminary. We were very good friends. One of the Colley brothers went to California and did very well in the oil business. The youngest brother, Ambrose, stayed on the Colley farm. He was Ambrose, my buddy Jerry's dad. He is the one I really knew well. Their mother, Grandma Colley, was living when I was a young lad and used to hang about there. A very sweet old lady. She quite often had a little treat for Jerry and me. The best way to a kid's heart. When Fred O'Brien came east one time, he and I drove down to Erie and spent the night with the Colleys. Lovely place. The eldest, Father Francis, was ill. Only saw him a little bit. Father Joe and I palled, but Father Steve was occupied with some farm chores. We talked at dinner. Father Charlie Colley and Father Chas Crowley were both aboard for a short time. I expect they were about parish duties. We had a real pleasant evening. Other than Uncle Gene and Aunt Bestis, he is the only one that could tell me anything about my grandfather McCarey. I don't know anything about Mary Ann, only she died when quite young. I sort of recall Aunt Bestis saying, "Mother was never the same after Mary Ann's death." When Michael was a young lad, he became sick with typhoid fever. He was sick for quite a while. He never became rugged and strong. Uncle Gene told me, Michael was not cut out to be a woodsman. That was the days of big timber. Goodrich Lumber Co. was operating in the area at the time. John became one of their foremen. Uncle Gene did some teamwork for them, but he had a full-time job taking care of the farm. Because he spent quite a bit of time under doctor's care, Michael and the doctor from Port Allegheny became real good friends. He had him read some books on medical topics. There also was a visiting schoolmaster who took an interest in Michael. He got him interested in Charles Dickens' works. He became a real Dickens fan. I think he even left some on both Jean and me. Eliza, Aunt Bess's right name, was musical. She learned to play the organ. Some way they got an organ, and every 2 weeks Eliza went to Olean and had lessons from Professor Crumpf, who played the organ at St. Mary's Church in Olean and taught music at St. Bona's College. Eliza became the church organist at St. Mary's at Sartwell. She even gave some lessons. John got hold of a violin. He could fiddle a little, not by note but by mimic. Dad used to say John can mimic anybody. If you can learn by mimicking, John can do it. Anyway, they say John fiddled for some of the neighborhood dances. It is hard for me to imagine, but John must have been quite a character. He was a popular guy in the valley. My mother said the first time she saw John McCarey, he had on the biggest and loudest plaid suit she ever saw. I can't get out of the Irish settlement without a word about Bill Lundgren. When I was a little kid visiting the farm, Bill Lundgren would come by to visit. Uncle Gene used to say, "That Lundgren, yeah, he can visit, that is all he can do. He never was fit for work, just blab." He was an old fellow near grandmother's age. We were out on the back porch this nice afternoon. Bill was telling me some of the tales of this area. "Look up there where those big pines are. It was all woods, big trees. It was a place like that the Indians came for me. At first they seemed friendly. Then they said they came to get me. I told them I couldn't go, I had this wood to split. They wouldn't take no for an answer. I know Indians like to deal, so I said, give me a hand splitting this wood and I'll go peaceful. I split one end of this timber, put a wedge in it. I got one of the Indians to take a hold there. Then I split the other end a bit, put a wedge in there. Got the other Indian to catch a hold there. I had them give a mighty pull, and I knocked out the wedges. Got both Indians good. I was afraid they would whoop and holler and bring on some more Indians, so I chopped both their heads off. Nobody ever found out about it because of the flood. While I was figuring what to do with their bodies, come up such a rainstorm it washed them, logs and all, down that side hill and into the creek. Nobody has ever known what happened to those Indians until now." That's so funny. Aunt Bestis came out. She had just heard some of this tale. She jumped all over Bill for filling that child with those silly lies. Over the years, I have heard some parts of old Bill's stories, mostly from Jerry Colley when we roomed together in Bradford. Something would come up and Jerry would say, "That is almost as bad as a Bill Lundgren story." He might give out what he could remember of one of Bill's tales. I don't think Bill was the only liar in the settlement, but he was pretty well known for that. One time Bill was not feeling well and he came down to see Dad. Dad knew all about old Bill. He gave him a prescription Bill quoted all the time. Doc says, "I got to slow down and take it easy." Bill liked what the doctor had ordered. To sort of counteract old Bill's Indian stories, Aunt Bestis told Jean and me some stories about the Indians that she got from grandmother. When Uncle Gene was a small boy, old Shango and his wife with a couple of their kids stopped in. The baby was in a crib. Mrs. Shango went over and picked up the baby. Grandmother was scared to death, but she went out and made them a cup of tea and served them some food. Mrs. Shango held the baby all this time. They sat quite a while, talked a little, not much. Then Mrs. Shango came over and gave the baby to Grandmother, and they went down the road. Grandmother had another experience with Indians. There is a shortcut over the hills to Ceres, New York. It is very steep and no road, just a trail footpath. It is 6 miles by the road. This is half of that, but steep. You can lead a horse through here, but not ride very much of it. This time Grandfather was sick and Grandmother went to Ceres for medicine. Part of it was a gallon of whiskey and some groceries. She was loaded down, coming back over the trail, and just in a steep and narrow place, she met a group of young Indian men. She was scared and had heard stories of Indian attacks. She felt panic but knew she shouldn't show it. She walked along and met this group in a very steep and narrow place. They stepped aside and let her pass without any trouble. I remember grandmother as this frail little lady by the fire, but she must have been somewhat rugged in her day. I sort of see her sitting by the kitchen window near the big stove after breakfast. Uncle Gene would fill her clay pipe in his corn cob and sit by her and read some of the paper to her. She usually wore a dark dress and white apron, sometimes the little laced cap. She almost always had some sewing handy, socks or shirts, sometimes knitting. She was always busy. She always had her prayer book and beads handy. Quite often she would call us kids to come to her room, and she would give us some peppermints or had candy treat. She had a few Irish expressions. Jean would remember better than I. Musha child was one. I think it is like, God bless. John McCarey had picked up a few expressions in Gaelic. Some of these he used to sort of scare us kids. The story of the three bears, the old Goramore Corker, the three Fictizanas, and the Tatternboob Witch, something like that. They had a bearskin rug with head and jaw and big teeth. John would get down on the floor with this over his head and growl out this stuff at us. Of course we were excited. Do it again, Uncle John. The rest of the family couldn't see it, but we kids loved it. Do it again, Uncle John. When Dad was up on the farm with us, he and Grandmother would go into the parlor and talk. John would try and keep us kids occupied with the tricks or games, checkers, mumbly peg. Sometimes he would get out the fiddle, with Old Aunt Rowdy, Buffalo Girls, One More River to Cross. On rare occasions he would get out the fiddle. That was an extra treat. When Dad, Uncle Gene, and John would go out to the barn and talk about tons of hay, livestock, that was boring. I could shep good company. From about the age of 10 until I was in college, I had to go to summer school to catch up. I spent a lot of my summer vacations on the farm. I know the other kids up and down the valley as well as in Portville. Jerry Colley on the next farm and I grew up as buddies. I knew that Dad was wise in having me spend summers on the farm. A good influence. He understood me pretty well. When Michael was a boy, he had farm chores like any other farm boy. But he got into some extra jobs, not paid jobs, but going to school early and starting the fires, bringing in some water, a bit of janitor work, sweeping, etc. He became sort of a teacher's handyman. One time a man came to the school and put on a magic lantern show for the school. It was arranged that the man stay at the McCareys. The man taught Michael how to run the lantern and put in the slides while he lectured, and then put the slides back in their place in the boxes. The show was well liked, and it was arranged to repeat it in the evening for the parents. A potluck dinner was arranged someplace nearby. John and Michael somehow got back to the school early. Michael had to show John how the apparatus worked. He thought he did it just right. The man came back, and all was set up for the show for the parents. Some of the slides were mixed up, and the man was furious. Uncle John said one day, "Ask your dad about his magic show." About all he would say is, "That is the most embarrassing thing in my life." When Dad finished Rock Run Country School, it was Port Allegheny or Smethport for academy or high school. The Sartwell family, who had helped start St. Mary's Catholic Church, had moved to Smethport, ran a lodge and a livery stable. It was arranged Michael could be nightman at the livery stable, board and room while he went to the academy days. This was a 3-year affair. After this, he came home and got a teaching job in the Annan Creek Country School, the adjoining valley to Rock Run. 6 miles by road, about 3 miles over hill, steep and rough. He completed the year with only the academy diploma, found he needed some teacher training. He arranged to go to Mansfield Normal School on the advice of a teacher from Smethport. He had a year at Mansfield, found out he did not want to teach at Annan Creek, got a job at the 2-mile school in the adjoining valley. He had medicine on his mind all the time. He kept in touch with the doctor in Port Allegheny who tried to get him into medical school. He needed more education, whatever he did. They found out that Valparaiso, Indiana had a very well accepted diploma. It was arranged that he go to Valparaiso Normal. got credit toward his tuition for janitor service, and cash money for looking after a team of horses that one of the school officials owned. Dad said about that, "When I got that real cash, I thought, I am on easy street." He would go to school 1 year, teach 2 years. This was after he got into Columbus Medical College in Ohio. He had by this time arranged to go to Dallas City, Pennsylvania, and teach in a 2-room school with another Irishman, Tom Driscoll. They became lifelong friends. Our families almost seemed like relatives. I want to put this one in. When Dad was a livery stable nightman in Smethport and student at the academy, he had an experience that he said I'll never get over. I was riding with him and coming back from a sick call as he got in the buggy. He said, "James, this is a sad case. I was a kid about high school age. The patient has had a good try at life. That is all we can hope for. It is sad, but that is the way things are. If you have a good, normal try, that is all we can expect. I have seen quite a bit of the other kind. The one that bothers me most happened a long time ago. It was Andy Tracy. He was in the Smethport jail for killing his sweetheart, so she wouldn't marry another fellow. It was of her family's influence. Andy Tracy never asked for mercy, showed no remorse, in fact, insisted he only did what he had to do. No, he was not crazy. He couldn't read or write, but he was an intelligent person. There was a driveway between the Sartwell house and the jail. The front of the livery stable faced the back of the jail. Andy Tracy would be at his barred window as Michael went in and out. They got to talking to each other, the news of the town and so on. He even got to reading to Tracy some of the things from his books. Tracy was real interested. Dad found he couldn't read or write. They would hold these reading sessions as long as there was light to read. The deputy found out, and in the cold evenings, he would have the lad come in and read some of his school books. The deputy told Dad that the reading had a good effect on that man. Tracy's trial was held up quite a while, so they visited all winter and got well acquainted. Uneducated, but a bright man, a real decent fellow. He wanted to be kind, sorry his girlfriend was gone, but no remorse. He insisted he did what he had to do. A day or two before his trial, Andy Tracy was found dead, hung by his own shoestrings in his jail cell. Dad said, "I have put in a lot of time thinking about this affair. There seems to be some sort of mental balance that we don't know how to measure or adjust. I felt that man was as sane as anyone I know, but there was an unbalance, no remorse. I am puzzled about that." Things about Dad's early life, schooling, etc., I have only a little glimpse of here and there. Something would cause him to tell me of something that happened to him. I came home from school griping about what the teacher had said. We had to learn the bones of the body. Who needs that stuff? I have a talent for saying the wrong thing, both time and place. Dad jumped on this. "James, this is not stuff. The structure of your body should interest you. It is far more interesting than baseball or movies." Let me tell you the trouble I had at Columbus Medical College. The first year, when Christmas vacation came, I was studying anatomy. That is the structure of the human body. I was having a real struggle with it. We worked in groups of 4, and it was difficult to really get a hands-on in the dissecting laboratory. I couldn't afford to go home for holiday. I had to keep my job at the insane asylum. I got room and board and $25 a month cash. I did the janitor work for 2 dormitories. I found out it was possible to get a cadaver to dissect and use of the laboratory for $40. That was a fortune to me and way out of my reach. I told John Stratton about it. We raised the money and got the body and had 2 weeks of hands-on dissection and anatomy study. One of us would read the manual and the other dissect and change about. $40 was an awful lot of money then, but it was the best money I ever spent. When Stratton and I ever get together, we talk about the Christmas present we gave ourselves. Anatomy is difficult, but most interesting, even fascinating. Your professor is right to get studying your bones and their function. I am not sure when Liza, Aunt Bestes, was stricken by paralysis. She is 6 years older than Dad. I think it was during his last year at medical college or while he was interning at the epilepsy ward at an insane asylum. He wanted to come home, but the family was keeping him informed, and Liza in particular said he should stay where he was and finish. He would be more problem than help at home. They kept him informed on her condition and the treatments she was getting. He said he read everything he could get about his sister's condition. The doctor he was working for at the asylum gave him all the current literature he could get from medical societies. Bed rest and care seemed to be the main thing. Aunt Bestis used to tell us she was kept in cotton battin. At one time she couldn't move either arms or legs and had to be fed. She rebelled at this treatment and insisted they help her get up every day, and she was determined to walk. But for most of one summer, she was mostly in bed. At that time, they didn't know about polio. Eliza pretty much cured herself, willpower. She used to laugh and say, "I drove Anne like you drive a horse. Help me up, help me down," and she never balked. She had rubs and scrubs, and they didn't have good bathing facilities. Heat water on the kitchen stove. Brought in a round of corrugated metal tub on the kitchen floor. I had a few baths that way, too, when I was a kid. Eliza did improve, but her poor hands terribly cramped, also her toes. She had pretty good use of both thumbs and first finger. The others still were badly cramped. She had trouble walking, especially on rough ground, but she would make it up to the garden, plant and weed, usually on her knees. She was a very determined person, and very cheerful and pleasant. She could blow off once in a while, and wind up with a big laugh. She could do most household chores except knit or sew, and I guess she had been quite a good seamstress. She felt bad about that. Anna would do some sewing, and Bestis would look it over and sort of scowl. She might say, "Anna tries, but she is careless." Bestis could write. It was difficult for her, and she did it so it looked very nice. We treasured a note from Aunt Bestis. Anna took care of most of the correspondence, family-wise. It was amazing to see Bestis carry a pail of water in the crook of her arm as she took care of her garden. She was an interesting and pleasant person to know. I remember when I was starting on the violin, Bestis would help me get the right note by using her one good finger on the organ. I got quite a few tunes worked out that way. Aunt Bestis loved music, and one Christmas, Mother and Dad got them a Victrola with a nice collection of records. It was Liza's most prized possession. It was in the parlor. You couldn't go in there in your work clothes. You had to clean up, and she would put on a very nice concert. We had a lot of nice evenings this way. Bestis used to tell us about a neighbor who was a bit off called Aunt Ann Murphy. When Bestis was badly crippled up, this old lady would come in and say, "Liza, be you crazy?" Bestis would tell us, coming from that old gal, I wasn't sure. She was an authority on crazy. Bestis would laugh and say, "I don't know, but I am not going to admit it. At most meals on our farm, the women fed the men so they could get on to the job. Then they sat down to their meal. When I was a young kid, I got in on both meals. I would get to eat with the men and then have a bite with the ladies. Sometimes Jerry Colley and his mother would stop by for a bit of late breakfast or lunch. Sometimes other neighbors dropped by. McCarey's was a very hospitable place. Aunt Bestis was always the lady of the house. We all loved Bestis. I can't conceive how Dad was ever able to finance his education. During all this time, he once told me that he received $25 from home. He worked as a livery stable boy, waited on table, was a janitor. He was never handy with tools. He said, "It turned my hand to anything I could get." He finally was the assistant to the head doctor in the epileptic ward in the hospital. He got sort of a decent salary for that. Mother had me washing windows one day Dad came by. "You're doing all right, son. Now you're getting that from an expert who washed the windows at the Columbus Insane Asylum for the first and perhaps the only time they were ever washed." During the last 4 years at Columbus, Mother and Dad were keeping company. They were not engaged, but corresponded. Some of this time, Mother was at Fredonia Normal. Then she had a chance to take up the millinery trade, making hats. I never heard Dad tell of much activities at school. I know he sang in a chorus with Bill DeVere. Bill DeVere, a doctor out near Cleveland, visited us several times. Once he brought his quartet. They had been to a medical meeting in Rochester. It was a nice summer's evening. A lot of the neighbors came by, filled up the porch. These fellows performed. Old-time classical harmony. It was quite a hit. They had a whistler, and he did the Mockingbird song with a lot of bird calls. Bill DeVere played the piano and even had me squawk my fiddle a bit. Mother and Dad went to a meeting in Cleveland, and they visited the DeVeres. Bill was quite a joiner. He went to a lot of medical meetings and was always sending Dad some literature about them. There was a big reunion of Dad's class in Columbus just a few years before Dad died. He was disappointed that Bill couldn't make it. Dad got word of Bill's death just a few weeks later. When Michael came home a full-fledged medical doctor from Columbus, he had every intention of going back to Ohio and opening a practice. He and another pal heard of 2 towns near Cleveland with openings for doctors. Grandmother was not well and had been going to Ceres to a doctor. He informed her that he knew of an opening in Portville for a doctor. She didn't want him to go to Ohio and asked him to go down to Portville and look over the situation. He went to Portville, met with Dr. Rowley, who was very pleasant, said he thought there was room for and need of a doctor. Welcomed by Dr. Rowley, Michael Joseph McCarey, located in Portville. Katie McGavis Fox and her husband were running a boarding house. The McGavis family lived up a different road but attended St. Mary's of Sartwell Church. Michael now has quarters with meals at the Portville house. He got office quarters down the street over Mrs. Daggett's and her sister, Mrs. Deming's, millinery store. Up quite a long, steep stairs, and it remained his office for a good many years. Dad told me about his first house call in Portville. He was just getting settled in his new office. Got a call to go over on Maple Avenue. He said, I have taken care of quite a lot of sick in hospitals, sick wards. Even been on a few accident calls, but not house calls. He said, I walked over and found which house it was. Then I walked around the block to calm my nerves. When he was in and broke the ice, he discovered it was not much of a problem. He was able to help the sick person and was their doctor for many years.